Hi and welcome to a video that was originally going to be about a 32MB Savage 4 Pro, but when I went searching for it in my cards I came across a 16MB version as well, so I've got two versions. And then I remembered I've also got a motherboard, a Pentium 4 motherboard with the onboard version of this as well. So I'm still going to mostly make the video about the 32MB one as planned, but it'll be interesting to run a little comparison between the three chips and see how they perform against each other. The first card up is the 16MB version, so this is from Diamond. It's a Stealth 3 S540 and it's a 16MB Savage 4 Pro. I found a review of this from Anandtech online from back in the day in 1999. Basically they said it's a pretty well made card. Diamond were renowned for their quality builds, and they said while it was underwhelming, they did manage to get a bit of an overclock out of it. I think they even pushed it up to the Savage 4 Extreme kind of level. I think that they have a 143 megahertz clock as opposed to the 125 that this card usually has. Savage 4 Pro fits quite well with the cards that I've benched so far in my continuing effort to bench all my cards, because the competition at the time were the Voodoo 3, the Rage 128 Pro and the TNT 2, all of which I have figures for, so be interesting to see how it compares. On to the card that is kind of the main event of the video, though originally it was going to be exclusively about this card. This is my Creative Labs 3D Blaster Savage 4, so this is a 32MB version of the same card. I couldn't find any reviews online, which is a bit strange because Creative was a massive player back then and Diamond maybe a bit smaller, but they got reviewed and this one doesn't seem to have any, at least, that have survived the test of time. And all I could find was there's some interesting literature still kicking around on Creative's own site, just user guides and things like that. And also on RS Online, the electronic vendor here in the UK, they still had the promotional literature that was kicking around when they used to sell this card back in the day that's still lingering on their website. In that Anandtech review, they complained that the Diamond version of the card was overpriced at $129 and they expected it to drop to $100 pretty quickly, they said. And indeed, we can see from this magazine price listing that's exactly what happened. And yeah, the Creative 3D Blaster that we're about to look at sold for $90. And if you compare it to the competition, we've got the next one up is the Voodoo 3, which is $150, so $60 more, which kind of tells you where the Savage 4 is at. $190 for the 128 Pro. We've got the Millennium G400 coming at $180, and the king of the hill at the time, the TNT 2 Ultra, is $200. So yeah, Savage 4, bargain basement. In a 1999 edition of Maximum PC, they compared the launch of the Savage 4 Pro to Custer's Last Stand. They basically said that it now included all of the features that the previous Savage 3D should have had. I think it was things like 128-bit rendering engine and support for multi-textures and things like that. Should have been there really in the last generation, but they were here now. And we also have support for Metal, which is the proprietary API of S3 for gaming graphics to rival the likes of Glide and OpenGL, and also S3CT, which is S3's texture compression algorithm. S3TC is probably the lasting legacy of S3, who had dominated in the 2D era and were clearly struggling in the 3D era, but they created this texture compression algorithm that was different from the likes of JPEG in that it did its compression in chunks instead of all in one go as existing graphics compression systems did, and that was apparently suited to hardware and gaming graphics. So this actually survived up until very recently and was licensed by all sorts of people. The most recent royalty payment to whoever collected on S3's behalf these days was only 5 years ago in 2017. I think a lot of games consoles used it, so yeah, they did hang on with their technology up until quite recently. Test machine's a bit different to the one I usually use. I was getting some blue screens. I think it was a heat issue, so I've got an area case with more fans, and a different motherboard to get the Savage 4 Pro, and I'll probably be using this motherboard for the rest of the tests I do on the other cards. So it's a VIA chipset on an Elite Group P4VMM2, and the Savage 4 Pro is embedded in the North Bridge on that. I've got 512 megabytes of RAM and a Pentium 4 Northwood core running at 2 gigahertz. Getting my drivers running stably proved to be a bit of a challenge, let's say, for these two cards. I did find the original driver disk on archive.org for the Diamond card, but that absolutely did not work in any way whatsoever, and installed lots of proprietary Diamond software that I didn't really want. Quickly got rid of that. Tried a few other different versions of the Savage 4 Pro driver up to the latest release, and they all seemed a bit flaky, which I was quite surprised at. Eventually I found it was just labelled an engineering bit flip driver, which if you Google it you find it. I guess that had something switched, one bit changed from a 1 to a 0 or something, and whatever it did seemed to do the job, because it seems to run stable with both of these cards, so that's what we're going to be using. There isn't much you can do on it. There's some gamma stuff in the settings, and apart from that there isn't anything. I checked it to see if VSync was set or not, and it didn't seem to be, but I loaded up S3 Tweak, and that allows you to turn it off using that anyway, just to make sure. And it was a bit strange, because generally when I turn VSync off you see it when you run the likes of 3D Mark, as it appears in the list of settings when you get your results, but I still didn't see it. But I did a test where I set my monitor to 60 Hz and I was still getting in excess of that, so I'm assuming that it's off. On to a bit of benchmarking. So I'm going to do roughly what I've been doing so far, except with a few updates, largely because a few people made comments going, you can't use 3D Mark to do benchmarks, it's rubbish, you've got to use games. So fair enough, point taken. I shall add a few games in this time. I'm also going to add in an extra resolution that I haven't been benching at so far, of 1600 by 1200. So basically we're going to do 640 by 480, 800 by 600, 1024 by 768 and 1600 by 1200. We're going to do 3D Mark 99, we're going to do 3D Mark 2000, we're going to do Unreal Tournament as usual. But then in addition to those, exciting, we're going to be doing Earth 2150, we're going to be doing Expendable, and we're going to be doing Quake 2. And then not included in the main benchmarks, I'm going to do a little section at the end where we run what we can using the Metal API, and just see if that makes any difference. Ready to do some benchmarking. I should have said I'm only going to run the full bench on the Creative Labs 32 megabyte card. I assume that's the best of the three that I've got. So I'll run the full suite of benchmarks on that, and then what I'll do afterwards is I'll do a quick little comparison between the 32 megabyte version, the 16 megabyte version and the onboard version to see how they differ. And I'll also do some separate benches on Metal and see how that compares to Direct 3D. Taking a quick look at the results that we've already got, we probably should discount the GeForce 256 from this because it's really a next-gen card, but the others here are all contemporary of the Savage 4. TNT2, this is just a standard TNT2, is top of the pile over the Rage 128 Pro and the Voodoo 3. So adding in the Savage 4 Pro, what do we get? And we can see why it only cost $90 and the next cheapest card was $150. It's pretty well behind everything in every respect. Looking at the figures directly for the game demos in 3D Mark 99, it basically does okay. It's playable frame rates at 640 by 480 and 800 by 600 at both 16-bit and 32-bit. After that, well, you can forget it. It's all down into the 20s and the teens. So not really anything that you would want to have in your machine back in the day. On to 3D Mark 2000, pretty much the same kind of results as we had if we look at the benches that we've already done. TNT2 is the head of the current gen that we're looking at. GeForce 256 is well ahead, as you'd expect. A bit more of a mixed bag between the Rage 128 and the Voodoo 3. The Voodoo 3 seems to do better at higher resolutions, and the Rage 128 seems to do better at lower resolutions. But let's add in the Savage 4 Pro and see what we get. And pretty much what you'd expect, having just seen what we've seen in 3D Mark 99. Looking at the game benches, you kind of got playable frame rates at 640 by 480 in 16-bit color, 800 by 600 at medium detail. You're over 30, but beyond that, everything kind of goes downhill pretty quickly. 32-bit color, the game is essentially unplayable, both of them. Under 25 frames a second, even in 640 by 480 and 32-bit color. So a game that was slightly demanding is something that you wouldn't want to be really running on Savage 4 Pro in, I don't know, around about the year 2001. On to Unreal Tournament, which is a game that supports S3 Metal out of the box, as did a couple of Unreal Engine games back then. So we'll be looking at Metal separately after we've done these benchmarks. But in the meantime, if we have a look at what we've already got, so pretty much what we've seen before, except the TNT2 was snapping a bit at the heels of the GeForce 256 in Unreal, and the 128 and the Voodoo 3 were trading blows. So looking at the Savage 4 Pro, it's nowhere near, absolutely nowhere near anything. In fact, it's the furthest behind, it's much further behind the other cards than it was in 3D Mark, and yeah, pretty lousy performance. Frame rate wise, it's a similar story at 640 by 480 in 16-bit color. It's not bad, it's just under 50 frames a second. Around 30, just under, at 32-bit, so you could play it at that resolution. 800 by 600, still playable in 16-bit, just under 40 frames a second. You're down below 20 at 32-bit though, so it's kind of pointless having a 32-bit card. And the rest of them, as you can imagine, are all probably in unplayable levels, getting steadily worse as the resolution ramps up. But you could understand why somebody on a very tight budget might opt for this, to be able to play games at lower levels of detail and at lower resolutions. On to the games. So we're going to start with Quake 2. As I said, I haven't benched the other cards with this yet, so all we're going to see for these three games is the Savage 4 figures, just to see how it looks, and I'll add the other figures in the next video or two. And yeah, it's pretty much the same story as we've seen. It's like 800 by 600 and 640 by 480. It's okay, and everything above that, it's rubbish. So 640 by 480, we're getting over 60 frames a second. 800 by 600, we're getting over 40 frames a second. Everything else is well below 30 in an ever-decreasing slope. So I guess you could use the Savage to play games like this at lower resolutions. Next up, we've got Expendable. We could run the full load of resolutions at both 16-bit and 32-bit color in this, and it did a bit better. I guess it's more simplistic graphics, but we're getting 63 at 640 by 480 at 16-bit, 46 at 32-bit, and then 800 by 600 we were getting 46 at 16-bit and 32 at 32-bit. 1024 by 768, we're still doing alright in 16-bit, where we were getting 31, getting unplayable in 32-bit at that resolution though, with only 19.8, so 20 frames a second. Then thereon afterwards you're into the teens and single figures. So I'd say Expendable is runnable, probably at both 32-bit and 16-bit color, certainly up to 800 by 600, certainly 16-bit at 1024 by 768, so yeah, you could play a game like this quite happily on this card, I think, without any expectations of upping your resolution too far. Finally, we've got the mad little stress test gizmo thing that comes with Earth 2150. And again, similar, we've got 640 by 480. It does pretty well at 16-bit color with nearly 70 frames a second, 54 at 32-bit color. Then onto 800 by 600, we've still got over 50 frames a second for 16-bit, and still running at about 35 for 32-bit. You're just dropping below 30 at 1024 by 768 and 16-bit color, but all of the other resolutions above that are probably unplayable, and you don't even want to go to 1600 by 1200 because it's not pretty. Finally, a quick test and a quick graph to compare the three Savage 4 Pro chips, and to do this I did just a 3D Mark 99 bench. It did one at 800 by 600 and one at 1024 by 768. When the results came in, I was a little bit puzzled because the 16 megabyte card seemed to outperform the 32 megabyte card quite significantly, and I couldn't figure out why that would be, so I had to go off and do a bit of Googling. What I found out was a bit surprising. It seems that despite the fact that these are all labelled Pro cards, different manufacturers apply different clocks to their cards, and the Diamond is obviously clocked faster. So it turns out that Creative, for some reason, clocked their core at 110 megahertz and the memory at 125, but Diamond clocked their core at 125 and their memory at 143. So there's a fairly significant difference there. The onboard one was clocked at 120, but then it had all the overheads of using system RAM and all of that kind of thing. But yeah, that surprised me, and it actually turns out the card that I didn't bench thoroughly is the faster of the two. I know there was a version of the Savage 4 called the Savage 4 LT, presumably stands for light, and that was clocked at 110, but this Creative card is definitely marketed as a Pro, so it's a bit strange. I might have to see if I can overclock it to at least match the Diamond, if not go up to the 143 of the Extreme. Bit surprising. Lastly, we come to looking at the Metal API. So there's quite a few different things you can look at for this. The one that you see most often probably online is the mod for Unreal, which I believe actually came from S3 themselves. They wrote some levels and some textures for the original Unreal, and you could have a look at those by adding them in. But we're not going to do that because Unreal Tournament came with Metal support as standard, and that's what we're going to use. I did do a bit of benching on this. I didn't do a graph, but essentially Metal does seem to give you quite a performance boost. So at 800 by 600 you are getting 34.5 frames a second in Unreal Tournament, but using Metal you are getting 43.7, and if you went up to 1024 by 768 it was unplayable in 32-bit at 19 frames a second, but you're getting up to an almost playable 27.5 with Metal, so it did seem to give it quite a performance boost in the games that supported it. And what we're going to do here is we're just going to run through the intro sequence and have a little bit of a compare of how it looks in Metal and how it looks in Direct 3D, and then I went in and played a deathmatch round with each as well, so we'll have a quick look at that. So we'll have a quick look at the drive through at the beginning of the game, and then I'll just leave the video to play on for a few minutes so you can have a look at the differences in actual gameplay. That's pretty much it for the speaking part of this video, so if you've got this far, thank you very much for hanging in there. I hope you enjoyed watching it. I hope you'll join me for the next one, and until then, goodbye.
spring.